Back in the day, two games having the same title wasn't necessarily an indicator that they were exactly the same. In fact, there were pretty much always some noticeable differences. By the way, when I say back in the day, I'm mainly referring to the early and mid-90s. Nintendo and Sega were in fierce competition with each other, and so any and all differences between each other were taken into consideration. The most notable thing would have to be all the games released for both systems that had the same title but were totally different games, and in some cases not even made by the same developers. But even when the games were made to be similar, they'd often still have some pretty noticeable distinctions just because the hardware was so different. The most noticeable difference was often the sound in each game, since each console had totally unique sound hardware. I mean, even just looking at the Sega side of things, the FM synthesizer chip inside the Genesis was really unlike any sound hardware you'd find in other consoles. I'll talk about the misconceptions and merits of the Genesis sound chip in another video, but for now it's just important to know how different it was. Besides the sound, the visual and performance capabilities of each system were pretty different as well. The Super Nintendo could handle a lot more colors, but the Genesis infamously had a faster processor, which often had a big impact on how the games would run. For example, sports games would generally run smoother on the Genesis, and the well-regarded NHL games were a good example of this. Then on the other end of things, the Super Nintendo was able to show more different colors overall and at once, so games would look different. And if you're wondering, I've taken a lot of this stuff into account with some of the decisions I've made for my own collection. For example, I have the Super Nintendo versions of Zombies Ate My Neighbors as well as Lost Vikings, because I think they look nicer, whereas I chose the Genesis version of Earthworm Jim because I think the music is better, among other reasons. I should also point out that with Lost Vikings and Zombies Ate My Neighbors, those games used more buttons than the standard Genesis controller had. Of course, you could use the 6-button controller, which I highly recommend, but that is something to consider. Although, I think the biggest example of the Genesis needing the 6-button controller would have to have been for Street Fighter 2. I mean, if you used the 3-button controller, you had to press the start button to switch between punches and kicks, and that just sucks. Perhaps the most infamous difference between versions of a game was the missing blood in the original Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat. I think differences in other games are more important nowadays, but that was definitely a huge deal back in the day, and so I had to mention it. There's also some other weird situations like Sunset Riders here. You see, Sunset Riders was originally an arcade game, and so both the Sega Genesis version and Super Nintendo version were essentially ports of the arcade experience. The Super Nintendo game ended up being a pretty faithful conversion, and I'd argue that it even improved the controls. The Genesis version, on the other hand, almost feels like a totally different game and made a lot of changes from the arcade. As a result, people generally praise the Super Nintendo version more, although I think the argument can be made that the Sega version holds up as its own unique experience. There's also situations where a game gets ported to a later generation of consoles down the road, sometimes with enhancements and sometimes just as part of a compilation, or perhaps even both. Let's take a look back at Street Fighter 2. This game came to the Sega Saturn later on, and it's a really close port of the original arcade game, but it's not the version most people remember playing. So that's kind of tricky. Should you go for the version with more nostalgic value, or the version that could be argued is superior? It should be noted that I think all these differences are a positive. It harkens back to a time when different systems offered different things. In later years, games being released on different platforms would often just mean a difference in resolution or frame rate that the average person wouldn't even notice. Look, I love channels like Digital Foundry, but I think an unfortunate side effect of the work they do is that gamers have become obsessed with details that shouldn't matter as much as they do, as opposed to back in the day when there were some very real differences that made these consoles feel more distinct. Anyways, as always, I'd like to ask if all of you agree with me or not. Do you think games with the same title having more distinctions was a good thing or not? Be sure to let us know in the comments, and I will see ya in the next video.